As if our farmers needed another problem to contend with, plagues of mice are eating away at crops and harvests, and the problem looks set to get worse.
Sometimes, the most powerful stories on our planet unfold far away from human eyes, on windswept rocks, surrounded by endless gray oceans, where nature quietly battles to survive. In these forgotten places, every species, every breath of life, carries the weight of an entire ecosystem. It's here that we see both the beauty and fragility of our world, where one small creature can tilt the balance between life and extinction. Our planet's history is full of grand gestures and monumental efforts, but few have been as bold, as audacious, and as quietly heroic as what happened on a small island chain in the subantarctic seas south of New Zealand. It began as a desperate attempt to save a dying ecosystem, an island overrun by mice. What followed would challenge the limits of science, conservation, and human willpower. This is the story of how they eradicated every last mouse. And what happened next shocked everyone. Far from the reach of civilization, across the roaring southern seas and beneath the constant shroud of mist, lie the Antipodes Islands, a forgotten frontier at the edge of the world. Hidden some 860 kilometers southeast of New Zealand, these islands are carved from ancient volcanic rock, a landscape sculpted by fire and forever tested by relentless wind and rain. Here, the air hums with the cries of seabirds, the ground trembles beneath their nesting colonies, and the isolation feels absolute. For most, the Antipodes are little more than a dot on a distant map, a place few will ever see, and even fewer will understand. But for scientists and conservationists, these islands represent something sacred, an untouched world, home to life that exists nowhere else. The Antipodes parakeet, bright green against the dark moss, and the elusive Reischek's parakeet, both unique to this small corner of the planet, thrived in a world without predators. For thousands of years, evolution here unfolded in silence and safety, uninterrupted by the presence of mammals. The balance was delicate, intricate, and perfect. But as human history has shown, even perfection can be shattered by the smallest of intrusions. No one could have imagined that the downfall of this paradise would arrive hidden within the hull of a wooden ship. In the early 1800s, when whalers and sealers roamed these waters, a silent invasion began. Stowed away among the barrels and ropes, a few unremarkable mice made landfall on the Antipodes. To those sailors, they were invisible, just stowaways, unworthy of a second thought. But their arrival marked the beginning of an ecological unraveling that would haunt the islands for centuries. At first, the mice went unnoticed. They multiplied quietly, their numbers swelling with each passing season, exploiting a land where no predators existed to keep them in check. Soon, the ground itself seemed alive with their movement. Hundreds of thousands of them spread across the archipelago, gnawing through seeds, devouring insects, and stripping plants of life. What began as a small infestation turned into a plague. Then came the horror that would stun even hardened researchers. The mice turned on living prey. Night vision cameras captured what seemed impossible: swarms of tiny rodents attacking seabird chicks in their nests, gnawing through down feathers, flesh, and bone. The footage was gruesome and silent, except for the wind and the helpless cries of dying birds swallowed by the night. The Antipodes, once a sanctuary, had become a battlefield where nature itself was being devoured from within. By the dawn of the 21st century, scientists knew the truth. If nothing was done, the antipode's rare species would soon vanish. And so, from this despair, an idea took shape. In 2011, the New Zealand Department of Conservation began crafting a plan so ambitious it bordered on the impossible: to completely eradicate every mouse from the Antipodes Islands. The goal was absolute: not one survivor. The operation was named the $1 Million Mouse Project, a title that reflected both the monumental cost and the audacity of the mission. It drew together an unlikely coalition: the DOC, the Morgan Foundation, WWF New Zealand, Island Conservation, and thousands of ordinary people who refused to let a unique ecosystem die. Together, they raised roughly $1 million, enough to attempt one of the most challenging eradication efforts in human history. But money was only the beginning. The real challenge lay in logistics. How do you carry out such a delicate mission on one of the most remote and unforgiving islands on Earth? Planning began with grim precision. The Antipodes are treacherous. Cliffs rise sheer from the sea. Fog blankets the land for days, and storms lash without warning. Even reaching the islands meant surviving a voyage through some of the roughest waters known to sailors. Every piece of equipment, every drum of bait, and every tool had to be ferried by boat and then unloaded in dangerous surf. The team relied on helicopters specially modified to distribute bait evenly across the island's rugged landscape. 65 tons of bait were prepared, each pellet designed to lure mice while sparing native birds as much as possible. The pilots would have to fly in perfect grid patterns, covering every inch of terrain twice, leaving no shadow, no valley, and no burrow untouched. One mistake, one pregnant mouse left alive, could doom the entire effort. The margin for error was non-existent, and the stakes could not have been higher. When winter arrived in 2016, the operation began. It was the season of scarcity, when food was hardest to find, the perfect moment to ensure the mice would take the bait. The weather, however, was merciless. Freezing rain lashed the cliffs, winds howled across the ridges, and the days vanished into endless gray. Still, the helicopters took flight. Their rotors beat through the fog, echoing over the waves as bait rained down in arcs of precision. The pilots followed GPS-guided routes with unwavering focus, their fuel running low as they fought against the wind to reach every corner of the islands. Below, teams on the ground trudged through mud and freezing water, monitoring bait distribution and repairing equipment battered by the storm. It was an endurance test that pushed both human and machine to their limits. Weeks passed, and the work continued, relentless and unforgiving. By August, the final pellets had been dropped. The mission was complete. All that remained was to wait, to see if the silence that followed was one of success or of failure. When the team left, the islands fell quiet again. The sea resumed its eternal rhythm, and the wind reclaimed its lonely song. The marks of human presence began to fade, footprints washed away, equipment removed, and the faint blue of the bait pellets dissolved into the soil. Months turned into seasons, and the world waited for news. The first monitoring teams returned cautiously, scouring the landscape for any sign of survival. No droppings, no gnawed seeds, no tiny footprints in the mud. The evidence pointed to success, but it was still too early to celebrate. Nature moves slowly, and certainty in such matters comes only with time. The islands endured another harsh winter, empty of mice, yet watched from afar, with quiet anticipation. Then, at last, after a year of waiting, the verdict arrived. No trace of the invaders remained. The Antipodes Islands, once drowning under a tide of 200,000 mice, were declared completely free. The silence that followed was no longer the silence of loss, but of renewal. A fragile, haunting reminder that even at the edge of the world, redemption is still possible. For those who had dedicated years to saving the Antipodes Islands, the announcement felt almost unreal. The mission that had once seemed nearly impossible had succeeded on its very first attempt. Not a single mouse remained. After centuries of imbalance and destruction, the Antipodes were finally free. When confirmation arrived, disbelief turned to awe, even among those who had dared to hope. Word spread quickly across the global conservation community, and what had once been a quiet, isolated archipelago suddenly became a beacon of triumph. Scientists, environmentalists, and organizations around the world looked to the Antipodes as proof that even the most fragile and remote ecosystems could be brought back from the brink. But the greatest surprise was still to come. In the months that followed the eradication, researchers who returned to monitor the islands witnessed something extraordinary. Nature, once silenced by invasion, was coming alive again. The pace of recovery defied expectation. Within weeks, faint traces of new growth began to spread across the once barren landscape. The ground that had been stripped bare now shimmered with the green of seedlings unseen for decades. The sound of life, the flutter of wings, the cries of nesting birds, and the low hum of insects began to fill the air once more. For the first time in generations, the Antipodes seemed to breathe again. The transformation was almost unsettling in its speed. The land that had been choked by an unnatural silence erupted with sound and motion. Seabirds, long driven to desperation, returned in vast numbers. Gray petrels, black-bellied storm petrels, and other species that had teetered on extinction began to nest again, their chicks surviving without the threat of being gnawed alive in the dark. Each breeding season brought new signs of life, and soon the cliffs and burrows of the islands were alive with noise and movement. The haunting cries of birds that had once faded into memory now echoed across the sea. It wasn't just the birds that returned. Beneath the soil, insects that had nearly vanished began to multiply, restoring the delicate web that sustained the island's ecosystem. Seeds that had once lain dormant for decades sprouted once more, reclaiming the earth from decay. Vast swaths of tussock and megaherbs began to rise again, painting the islands with colors and textures unseen since before the invasion. Researchers described the experience as something beyond science, something almost spiritual. They spoke of the moment as if the island itself had exhaled, releasing years of suffocation in one sweeping breath. To stand there and witness life return so powerfully was to see resilience in its purest form. What had been broken by human error was now mending through human resolve. This recovery was not gradual. It was immediate and visible. The balance that had been stolen was rapidly re-establishing itself. Insects nourished the soil, birds spread seeds through their droppings, and vegetation stabilized the fragile slopes. The air, once heavy with decay, now carried the scent of growth. Every sign of life was a quiet victory, a reminder that even the smallest efforts toward restoration could yield results beyond imagination. To those who had studied the islands for decades, the transformation stood as undeniable proof of nature's power to heal when given a chance. The Antipodes became a symbol of hope for conservation efforts everywhere. not as a miracle, but as a testament to what careful planning, collaboration, and determination could achieve. The success of the operation resonated far beyond the southern seas. It reached scientists across continents, inspiring them to pursue similar missions on other endangered islands. What had once been a forgotten frontier had now become a living testament to restoration and resilience. Yet behind this story of rebirth lay another, one defined not by data or statistics, but by the people who made it possible. Each person involved had carried an immense burden. The helicopter pilots who flew through storms, often with visibility so low that the sea and sky blurred together, risked everything to ensure no corner of the island was missed. The field teams who stayed behind endured weeks of isolation, freezing temperatures, and the relentless assault of wind and rain, living in tents surrounded by the roar of the ocean. The planners and scientists spent years consumed by details, calculations, supply chains, and contingency plans, knowing that one error could unravel everything. For them, this was not just work. It was a test of faith in humanity's ability to repair the damage it had caused. Each person understood the weight of failure. If even a single mouse survived, the population could rebound within months, and the years of preparation, the millions of dollars raised, and the sleepless nights spent planning and waiting would mean nothing. The emotional toll was heavy, but so was the resolve. When the confirmation of success finally came, the reaction was overwhelming. Some who had worked on the project for years wept openly. Others stood in stunned silence, unable to process the enormity of what had been accomplished. It wasn't just about eradicating mice. It was about rewriting the ending of a tragedy that had begun centuries ago. The team had faced nature at its harshest and their own doubts at their deepest, yet they had emerged victorious. In a world where environmental destruction often feels inevitable, the Antipodes Islands became living proof that change is still possible, that even after centuries of loss, the balance can be restored. The story carried a quiet, haunting power, the image of an island once consumed by silence, now alive with sound. Every call of a seabird, every rustle of grass, and every flutter of wings carried the echo of what it took to make it happen. Human determination, sacrifice, and the will to set right what had once gone so terribly wrong. The Antipodes stood not just as a sanctuary, but as a reminder that even at the farthest edge of the world, when the odds seem insurmountable, life can rise again. The $1 Million Mouse Project changed how the world saw the relationship between people and nature. What began as an act of desperation became one of the greatest examples of what determination and science can achieve when guided by purpose. The success proved that even the most complex and remote eradication efforts are possible. Yet it also forced humanity to confront hard questions. How far should people go to fix the damage they have caused? When does intervention cross the line between help and harm? The Antipodes victory sparked these debates within the global conservation community and inspired new hope across continents. Restoration projects began to spread, from the Galapagos to South Georgia, each shaped by lessons first learned in New Zealand. The country that once sent ships into the unknown was now leading a new kind of exploration, one that sought to heal rather than exploit. The Antipodes' success became the foundation for New Zealand's larger dream, Predator-Free 2050, a vision to eliminate rats, stoats, and possums from the entire nation. What once sounded impossible now felt within reach. When scientists returned a year later, they expected quiet progress. What they found instead was astonishing. The vegetation had surged into life, growing thicker and stronger than anyone thought possible. Bird populations were not just recovering, they were exploding. In some colonies, the number of surviving chicks had tripled. Species once believed to be on the edge of extinction were thriving again. But the greatest shock was beneath the soil. Researchers discovered that invertebrate diversity had risen sharply. Beetles, worms, and spiders, absent for decades, were now abundant. The mice had once consumed them endlessly, but with their disappearance came a wave of recovery that felt almost immediate. The island had come alive in every sense. Nature had waited in silence for centuries, and now it was reclaiming what was lost. The speed of change was so extraordinary that researchers described it as watching nature accelerate time itself. The Antipodes became living proof that healing doesn't have to take generations. Sometimes it begins the moment we stop the harm. The global impact was undeniable. The Antipodes story became a case study for scientists, governments, and conservation groups worldwide. It showed that no island, no matter how damaged, was beyond saving. It also demonstrated that the greatest victories come through unity. Scientists, pilots, donors, and volunteers from across the world had joined together for a single purpose, proving that collaboration could achieve what once seemed impossible. When the Antipodes were declared mouse-free in 2018, the celebration echoed far beyond New Zealand's borders. The success became a message to the planet. Even the most fragile ecosystems can recover when given the chance. Yet the story carried a reminder of how fragile that balance truly is. To save the island, poison had been dropped from helicopters, an act that seemed harsh but necessary. Without it, extinction was certain. With it, life returned. The operation raised ethical questions, but it also forced the world to face a difficult truth. Inaction can be more destructive than intervention. The goal was not to control nature, but to restore it to what it once was, a living sanctuary untouched by human mistakes. The Antipodes had been broken, but now they were whole again, a symbol of resilience and redemption. Today, the islands remain uninhabited, protected, and closely monitored. Scientists continue to record the ongoing recovery. Birds nesting in greater numbers, plants spreading across new terrain, and insects thriving in the soil. Each year brings discoveries that deepen the understanding of how ecosystems rebuild themselves once the pressure of invasion is lifted. The lessons learned here continue to shape conservation efforts across the world. And in the end, the $1 Million Mouse Project wasn't truly about money. It was about value. The value of life, balance, and second chances. The Antipodes stand as living proof that even when nature is scarred beyond recognition, it can heal. It cost $1 million, but what it gave back to the world in life, knowledge, and hope is beyond measure. The story of the Antipodes Islands isn't just about mice or birds. It's about us. It's about what happens when humanity decides to protect instead of exploit, to restore instead of consume. If this story moved you, take a moment to think about the power we hold, not just to destroy, but to rebuild. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, like this video, share it, and subscribe to the channel. Every bit of engagement helps more people discover the quiet victories happening across our planet. Victories that remind us why protecting the natural world still matters. Because sometimes the smallest creatures tell the biggest stories. And sometimes saving one tiny island can help save us all.